All right, everybody. Well, and welcome you guys to our next SCiCAST. My name is Joe Burgett, and it's my pleasure to introduce two folks that are going to speak to us about drones and privacy. First is Michael Hodgson from the Department of Geography at the University of South Carolina. And we also have a repeat SCiCAST, I don't want to say performer, that's not the right term, but presenter. Mr. David Sella-Villa, who is the current interim chief privacy officer with the South Carolina Department of Administration, as well as an adjunct faculty at USC. So two distinguished guests. Thanks you guys for coming on.
Thank you for the invitation, Joe.
Thank you, Joe.
All right, so let's just kind of get through it. Now, these guys, I'm going to speak to this here in a second, but are recently authored a paper on a subject that's really, really interesting. I'm just going to tease you there. But let's just kind of start out here. So many of the folks that are listening to this on the call are operating under Part 107 rules. And when I think of Part 107, I'm thinking commercial purposes and applications, but it's broader than that. So can you guys maybe unpack that a little bit? Who is Part 107 applicable to, and what is it?
Joe, I'm happy to answer that question. Thank you. And before I get started, I just want to say I'm very happy to be here, but everything you're going to hear me say today, I'm saying in my own individual capacity and doesn't represent, the state of South Carolina or USC or any other organization I'm affiliated with. So to your question, really the FAA has two categories of drone operation effectively. There are recreational flyers, and then everybody else falls under Part 107 with a little asterisk unless you have a COA. So we're not going to really talk about COAs here today. So if you meet the definition and the requirements for being a recreational flyer, you get to fly recreational. You still have to pass the test, but you have to be in a designated area, and there's a bunch of other rules. If you want to fly anywhere except in that designated recreational space, you have to follow Part 107.
Okay, awesome. So now my understanding here, again, the FAA governs the national airspace, and I've heard it defined as the national airspace being anything that's not under a roof. I'm certain there are other better definitions than that, but if the FAA operates and governs that, they explicitly operate operations, but they not necessarily govern the data that's collected. They don't regulate the information gathered. Is that correct? And can you maybe unpack that a little bit?
So simply put, the first part of that is true. Once you are in the air, you have to follow the FAA rules, and there are almost no FAA rules that we could find that govern what happens to the data that you're collecting. But I think Michael's going to give you a bit more of a nuanced answer.
Yeah, let me respond to this, Joe, because this is particularly important to me because I fly not only in our state, but in other states. But the reality is a bit more complicated. So as David indicated, the FAA has authority over national airspace. They also have authority over drone registration. But some states, for instance, Oregon and Nevada, they also require registration within the state. There are three other parts of operating an unmanned aircraft that's important here. The operator position for controlling the aircraft, the flight of the aircraft in the national airspace, and where you launch and land the aircraft. The FAA has explicitly allowed the state to create regulations to govern the launch and landing and the operator position for the aircraft. So many states, for instance, California and North Carolina, require the operator to obtain permission from the landowner, private, local, or state, for launching, landing, and operating the drone at a location. With regard to the collection of data, such as imagery, the FAA doesn't regulate this, okay? But the state and local regulations often do restrict the collection of imagery and how it may be used. And that's something that we're going to talk about just in a moment under different categories such as privacy.
All right, now you guys had both recently co-authored a paper. The title is State-Level Statutes Governing Unmanned Aerial Vehicles Used in Academic Research in the United States. And you published in the International Journal of Remote Sensing, which is a very well-read, well-recognized journal. And in that paper, you did a search of state and local regulations using keywords like drone and unmanned systems. And in your paper, you had you used that expression, which I really liked, patchwork quilt of regulations enacted by various different bodies. So can you maybe unpack a little bit about what that paper was, the scope of it, and some of the limitations associated with what you found?
Yeah, so we looked at the state rules in every state and the state laws in every state and looked for drone and unmanned to see all the possible drone laws that could apply. And what we decided is we're assuming that the people who read this article or most drone operators are not setting out to do bad acts. They're setting out with good intentions. So look, if you want to weaponize a drone or be a peeping Tom, this article is not for you, right? So assuming you have a good, valid intention, what we wanted to do was lay out the rules that we saw and create a method for navigating them so that you can be as compliant as possible with the state rules. Now, we only looked at the state rules because once you add the localities, it just gets way too complicated. But from other research that we did independent from this article, the state rules sort of show up again at the local level. So you'll be looking for the same type of things at the local level. And so the idea was, how can you be a successful drone operator and navigate the state rules and then take that same approach to the local rules as well?
Okay, so I completely appreciate that the article was kind of written under the framework of for academics, right? We have some academics on the call. I'm an academic, but a lot won't be. So when we're talking through here, is there anything that we should know specifically as South Carolina residents that may be applicable to academics and maybe not so for other folks that work in the government?
Well, not just for South Carolina residents, but the way most of the state rules are laid out is that they set out requirements for drone operations or limitations for drone operations. And then they have exemptions or exceptions for which in some states academics might qualify. So you still have to go through the thought process and the planning the same way. What rules do I have to follow? And then after you figure those out, then you can ask the question, do I qualify for an exception or an exemption? And it just so happens that academics in a few states have a few more exemptions and exceptions, but the thought process should be the same whether or not you're an academic.
Okay, great. And in your paper, you also talk about preemptive law. Could you maybe unpack what preemptive law is, and do most states have them?
Yeah, so I believe that there's a figure in our paper that shows this visually, which is easier if you haven't studied this issue before. But in any kind of hierarchical government system, like we have in the United States, where there's a federal government and state government and local government, the higher level of government can pass a law, and then by the fact that that higher level of government passed a law, it limits or prevents lower levels of government from passing a law on the same subject matter or doing a contradictory law. And what we found was there are some states have very strong preemptive drone laws, meaning that if you identify the state laws in those states, you don't need to look further to see if there are local rules. Some states have largely preemptive drone laws, meaning that you probably are safe not to specifically look at the local rules in those states. And some states have no preemptive laws, meaning that you have to, as part of planning for a lawful flight, if you will, you have to both look for the state rules and look for the local rules as well.
Right. So, and looking at that figure that you had described, and we had put on the screen, South Carolina is a state with no preemptive laws that you could find. So that makes it a little bit more complicated in that state, like local governments could have drone laws that you would need to research and be aware of. Is that right?
Yes. We didn't find any preemptive laws in South Carolina that would apply to drone operations generally.
Okay, great. Now, again, as a resident of South Carolina, I don't know where exactly I picked this up at, but I just know that I should not fly my drone over correctional facilities. But that's not, I mean, that's a state rule, right? I mean, that's not necessarily, while intuitive, that's not necessarily a federal law where you can't fly over prisons. Is that right?
Let me respond to this, is that not explicitly. As a general rule, it's illegal to deliver contraband and other things over prisons, obviously. Some states specifically spell this out in their statute, others don't. 16 states have restrictions on flying over or even near a correctional facility, regardless of the intent. So South Carolina's only drone-related statute prohibits flying within 500 feet of a correctional facility unless one notifies the Department of Corrections at least 5 days prior to the intended flight. Just as a matter of practice, it's best to avoid the issue altogether by staying away from prisons in any state.
Yeah, that's kind of a good life rule, to just avoid prison as a general practice. Okay, so you also talk about critical infrastructure, and avoiding that, and that makes sense for obvious reasons. But can you talk a little about how you know if you're near critical infrastructure and if there is a map to identify, where these quote unquote critical infrastructure items are?
Very, very interesting question, and one of the most challenging. The definition of what critical infrastructure is varies at the federal level and even among the states. In short, whenever you intend to fly, you should check the features that are stated in the FAA regulations and what the states say is a critical infrastructure. According to most state laws, critical facilities might include electrical power distribution facilities, petroleum natural gas production, surface distribution, manufacturing, water treatment, communication ports, and even railroad yards. The FAA offers some maps, but it only includes those features that the FAA intends to limit overflight, and very few critical infrastructures are in their list. However, the states can define and often do define critical infrastructures. If you wouldn't mind, Joe, we can use figure 5 from our article and an example of Erwin, Tennessee, and a nuclear fuels processing facility that's definitely critical infrastructure located in this small town. Okay. The challenge for us as a drone operator in planning is to know whether critical infrastructure exists in a flight path and to avoid it. Okay. The nuclear fuels processing plant is a little known facility outside the community, but the community is aware of it because many are employed there, and it recently went through relicensing and public review. Erwin is also a town in which it's a gateway to the Appalachians, and it's a heavily used whitewater facility as well. But if you look at any of the maps that we as drone operators would go to, including the Before You Fly, Esri's implementation of the FAA restricted zones, or other applications like DJI GeoZones, you will not find that facility and many other facilities that exist in Erwin. If you type in nuclear on Google Maps, you'll find it. Okay.
Very good. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about private property. In your paper, you talk about incidental observations where you might be flying your drone for mapping missions and you capture some data maybe on the side, or it's not the focus, but you capture a little bit of data. And you've got sustained operations where you're, which is a different category, and you use the word surveillance. And maybe can you unpack a little bit about what the difference is between incidental and surveillance, and what all that means for us as drone operators?
Yeah, the best way to sort of describe this is to think about a surveillance camera like in front of a bank, or a security camera in front of someplace with one, where the same image gets captured over a long period of time, or periodically, or within the GIS world. There's a very high level of temporal resolution, right? And so in this instance, most states sort of have a law that says you're not allowed to conduct surveillance over private property. And sometimes this is written specifically into drone related statutes, and otherwise it just might be a law that's on the books otherwise. So if you happen to fly over a piece of private property once and capture some data, that probably doesn't count as surveillance. But if you are doing it repeatedly, either because that property is the target of your data collection, or it's on the way to the target of your data collection, then the best way to sort of avoid this question of surveillance altogether is to get permission, because a lot of the surveillance statutes sort of lose their teeth once you get permission from the owner or holder of the property.
All right, very interesting. All right, guys, so we're going to take a quick break, everybody. As you guys may know, Bentley Systems is a supporter of SCiDuck, and they are the sponsor of this podcast. So we just want to take a quick break here and recognize those guys, and we'll be back on the other side to kind of wrap up our discussion. Hello, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the SCiCAST. As you guys know, a membership to SCiDuck is completely free to all government employees. We're able to keep the lights on from generous support of our industry partners. And I'm very pleased to thank and introduce you to Dan Koval with Bentley Systems. Bentley's been with us from the very beginning and has been supporting us financially and with software. So on behalf of the board and all of SCiDuck members, Dan, thank you very, very much for supporting SCiDuck.
Thanks, Joe. Like Joe just mentioned, my name is Dan Coble. I'm the Corporate Initiatives Manager for Bentley Systems. It is our pleasure to support SCiDuct and the rest of the agencies that are part of it. We are so excited for the opportunity to share our software with you and to be able to support your endeavors in learning. We're so excited and so proud of all the work that you all are doing, all the ways that you're finding to help out the community and the environment, and we're just so excited to support. So thanks again, Joe, and we're proud partners of SCiDuct.
Thanks, Dan. And for you guys that are listening, if you want more information on Bentley, just go to the SCiDuct website and our partners page, look for the Bentley logo and just click on it and you'll go right to their website. So thanks again, Dan, and enjoy the rest of the SCiCAST. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So we're going to finish up our discussion here with some of the, with one of the key things, the takeaways from the paper that I gathered that I think would be really useful you guys to listen through. But in this paper, you guys talk through about 7 best practices, kind of learning about everything that you guys talk through and the various different rules, but there's 7 takeaways. So you guys want to maybe talk us through about what those are and the 7 ways to kind of stay out of trouble.
Yeah, the first and foremost thing is that, putting anything in the air that can crash to the ground creates safety issues. And part 107, its main objective is to create safe operations for drones. So our biggest piece of advice is just follow the part 107 rules. You're going to be more likely to operate safely that way. The other thing another thing that we suggest is that you need to create a habit of documenting your intentions, both your flight paths and the purposes of why you're flying. On a single flight, if something goes wrong, this might not be all that valuable to you. But if you have a long history of documenting your flight paths and documenting your intentions, if something goes wrong down the line, you have something to show that you didn't mean to do something wrong. And that can go a long way in a lot of states to getting you out of trouble. And then, listen, we all know we operate drones to collect data, right? There are clearly people who fly drones just for the joy of flying or race drones or like that. But if you're listening to this, you're probably somebody who's operating drones to be able to collect data. So have a data management plan. Think through ahead of time. What do you intend to collect? Who's going to have access to it? How long are you going to hold on to it? What purposes are you going to hold on to it for and process it and use it? And with that in mind, you set yourself up for success before missions, after missions, and then if issues arise later, you show that you're being conscientious about what happens with the data.
I can comment a little bit about geospatial resources that are useful in planning the location of 4 different items, a launching, landing, and property types, private property, for example, correctional facilities, and what we think of as critical infrastructure. And most of us, who would be watching this are aware of geospatial resources that would be useful, and they're competent in using geographic information systems applications. But one of the items you could look for is county web services or other online web mapping applications. The county applications typically have property boundaries. The property boundaries may even have the owner of the property and contact information, extremely useful for determining who to ask permission from. And secondly, certain property types, such as the federal properties, are often national forest or more benign in terms of overflights. But private hunting clubs are probably some of the places you don't want to fly, particularly during the avian hunting season. Regarding critical infrastructure, the first step is to just visually analyze the study site using Google or Bing Maps, particularly the imagery associated with them, and determining whether anthropogenic facilities might be have some features that would be familiar to you as critical infrastructure. The best relevant geospatial layers to target critical infrastructure, probably not the right word to use to target, but to identify, is the Homeland Infrastructure Foundation level data sets. They're otherwise known as high field open and high field secure. You'll have access to the high field open data. Some state agencies may have access to the high field secure. As an example, for the nuclear fuels processing plant in Irwin, Tennessee, you'll find it in the EPA's toxic release inventory facility layer that's on the high field open web layers list. So that's probably one of the best categorical list of layers or locations I would suggest. The bottom line is, if you can get permission, then do that, get permission from the private, the state, or the local owners of the property. And my last comment here, which has served me very well, you always carry a remote pilot certificate with you because the FAA requires that. I've never been asked to see the remote pilot certificate. My personal experience is if you wear a bright yellow safety vest, no one, a public citizen or even law enforcement, will ever inquire about your intentions. And that's been my experience, and keeps me out of the woodshed, so to speak. So use the data management plan, as David mentioned earlier. That's your safety net. Okay.
Well, that's great, and I can attest to the safety vest, and especially the ones that you have to say, Part 107 pilot, stand back. I mean, I wear that throughout campus, just around hall in my office. There's some value there too. So, sincerely attest to that, guys. I really appreciate.
But Joe, if you're in the building, you don't have to follow Part 107.
That's true, but you can still wear the vest,
You can still wear the vest.
Stand back, drone operator, maybe not operating now, but stand back, magic happening. Guys, I really appreciate you joining us and kind of sharing your expertise. For you guys that are listening to this, I had talked to these guys ahead of time, and they had both agreed to offer up their help if you guys do have any questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to contact me directly through the SCiDuct website, and I can put in you contact with these guys. And like I say, they're experts in their fields, and they're take advantage of them if you can. So again, guys, Michael, David, thank you guys very much for sharing your expertise, and we look forward to having you on another SCiCAST soon.
Our pleasure.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.